One of the greatest known American authors is Nathaniel Hawthorne, a man whose most famous work, The Scarlet Letter, has just become a part of culture. People make references to that book as part of talking about the society we live in at different times, maybe even not being aware of what they are referring to. He was somebody who began to have great notoriety even while he was still living, and was eventually given responsibility as a representative to the United States. And so he and his family spent time living in Europe. And during those days, there was a fairly significant visit that they had made to Rome, because they had grown up with a Protestant suspicion about Rome specifically, about Catholics in general, and then they went and saw something very different than what they had imagined. They, as a family, were all impressed with what they saw as the culture of being Catholic, the beauty of the churches in Rome, the artwork, all of the things that come from the long history of the presence of the church there in the city of Rome. All of the art and architecture and music that represented that culture had such an impact on them that Nathaniel Hawthorne came away more critical of Catholic people than when he went there. Because he said, I really wonder that Catholics are not better men and women. Because he saw that they were surrounded by this beauty that should elevate them, turning our hearts and minds to God. And so his experience left him with even a worse taste in his mouth. But his daughter, Rose, was part of this family trip as well. And she had a very different experience. She saw something that her father missed because she looked a little bit closer. And while she certainly saw people that seemed indifferent to the life of faith and the beauty that surrounded them, she also was able to see heroic examples of faith and charity. In particular, in her case, she noticed all of these women who were dressed in funny ways to her that she came to recognize as nuns. And it was in their service, in their heroic acts of charity, in their service to the church, that she became moved enough that eventually she would grow up and become a Catholic. Now, she and her husband both would eventually become Catholic, and they had many difficulties in their marriage, and yet they both clung to the faith that they shared. And eventually, her husband would die, and she decided to become one of these women that she admired so much. So in her later life, she became a nun herself. And not only did she begin to practice the life of a nun, she started a new religious order, a group of Dominican sisters that are now named for her, the Hawthorne Dominicans. She would eventually then commit her entire life to the service of the poor, and in particular dedicated to caring for cancer patients. And so she came away from the same experience as her father by committing everything to the service that she witnessed, to a desire to follow the Lord. Today, her cause for canonization is underway. She is known now as Servant of God, Rose Hawthorne, as sisters continue to carry on the work that she started. Now, the story of this family and their trip to Rome highlights the power of influence. The power of influence for good or for bad. The recognition that we as a people of faith, we have an influence. There's no getting around having an influence. If we are Catholics, then we represent the Catholic Church in the minds of many people. In today's gospel, we are called on to take full ownership of that identity. We are told to be salt and light, to recognize that we have within our grasp the ability to bring about a greater good or to do something that would be better left, thrown out, and trampled underfoot. We have greater clarification in our readings as well that highlight what does it mean actually to be salt and light. Share your bread, shelter the homeless and oppressed, do not turn your back, remove malicious speech. Concrete words and actions that can reflect for good or bad what it means deep in us to be disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, it's also important to see that while we must take on that responsibility, that we ultimately recognize that the good of another person belongs to the Lord. Because Nathaniel Hawthorne and Rose Hawthorne, they both witnessed similar things, but came away with a very different experience. Nathaniel was turned off not because Catholics were doing bad things, but because they did nothing. He was so amazed at the beauty, again, of what they saw that he thought they ought to be elevated in what they did. The richness of Catholic life that he saw is something that he perceived ought to have an effect on our lives. And so it is true for us today. The richness of our Catholic life ought to have an effect on our lives. But we have to have eyes to see. We have to be able to recognize what it is that God gives us. Every time you come here for Mass, the Lord is pouring out on you His own life. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm here today because we celebrate the anniversary of that first Mass. That when you come in these doors for Mass, the Lord is giving you everything, entrusting to us not only the responsibility to be witnesses of faith, but the richness of life that allows us to be witnesses. Here we have food and word, sacraments and grace, all that would be necessary for our lives to be salt and light. When we take what God offers to us, when we come into Mass aware that we are here to meet the Lord and receive His gifts, then the measure that this is taking root in our lives is how we act when we leave. We come here to meet the Lord, and every genuine encounter with the Lord changes us in some way. And the way that we act because of that encounter, the growth in charity that should mark our lives, is the sign that our experience is working. It's important that we see that it is meant to call us to action. Because there are some people who come to Mass and they go out and they would say, I don't know why I go anymore. I don't feel anything. When the measure should be, do I do anything that reflects the love of God in me? Every single day, pretty much every moment of every day, offers to me the opportunity for greater charity. At times that can be heroic in care of the poor. At other times it can be as simple as common courtesy. When my mind is focused on the good of the other instead of on what I want myself, my life begins to be salt and light. And so the measure of the encounter with God comes because of the changing of my life, the transformation that allows me to make a difference. Going back to the story of the Hawthorne family, you should recognize that as you go about your day-to-day life as a Catholic, people are watching. And you never know who's going to notice. Who's going to notice an action that can draw them into a deeper life of faith themselves, like Rose. Or who's watching and thinks, I thought you were supposed to be Catholic, and walks away unimpressed, like Nathaniel. Our lives are to be witnesses to the place of God in the world. Now, I'm fortunate that as I have come here to this diocese, I've seen many, many examples. It's a great privilege of being a new bishop that I get to travel around and meet people and see the works that we are doing. And I've seen heroic example after heroic example. And so what I ask now as I come to your parish is that we work on having the eyes to see, to recognize the grace that God provides when we come for Mass, the eyes to see the life of charity among our brothers and sisters that can inspire us, and then the eyes to see the grace that God puts in our care as we go about our daily interactions, as we work to be salt and light. One of the most important ways to grow in faith is to just pay attention, because God surrounds us with everything necessary for our lives to flourish. But we often are more self-absorbed than we should be, and we don't notice the work of God. And so commit today, as you celebrate the anniversary of this parish, to that paying attention that allows you to receive more of the grace of God that then can be reflected in the way that you live. The very last line of today's first reading is a powerful kind of statement, a call to action so that our lives truly can be salt and light. Then light shall rise for you in the darkness, and the gloom shall be like midday. Today, the Lord provides for us and then calls us to action. And so my prayer is that each one of us may truly be the salt and light that the Lord is counting on.